Hi everyone, welcome back. Last week was really good and we had a kind of exciting start. Moving ahead this week, it's the ideas that I want to get in your heads. The importance of starting a project off right with a great charter, a mission statement, and having stakeholder support right up to the executives that are in charge. One of the most uh, elemental things I think in every continuing plan or disaster recovery is the basis of the plan itself, where it started from. There's kind of 7 key elements that I always addressed for success in any plan, and number one is always that executive support. We'll talk about these a little bit more. Stakeholder engagement, objectives, requirements, scope, milestone, and leadership. These are the 7 key elements that kind of fit, and if any one of them goes awry, the plans always fail. And no continuation plan or disaster recovery plan can ever recover without all these elements working decisively and effectively together. When I talk about support, especially executive support, you have to make sure that your CIO, CEO, whoever is in charge, the president, understands first the scope of your project. And that's defined very well in your project management classes, to where you need to get inside of the scope to understand everything from the logistics of the actual business plan, the financial of the business plan, to looking at how much human capital costs are going to accumulate over the course of the scope and time. They call this a triple constraint in a lot of cases, to where you're looking at time, the scope of the project, the financial aspects, everything that really brings you into the project itself and the whole length of the project from start to finish, and more importantly, some of the sub-elements that come together. There might be multiple small projects being managed inside one project to actually produce this. Think about putting a telephone system into your business. First, you have to have someone put in the wiring. Or if it's a voice over IP, you have to have the system internals up, and you have to have everyone on the same page, so there's enough robust system to actually activate and work the whole entire system before humans can actually go in and start placing in the hardware. So a lot of this is getting an executive on board and understanding the scope. And a good project manager works with you to do that. And that frame starts, how do we manage this scope if something happens in a failure? And each one of those aspects needs to be defined in the plan before you can start a continuation plan or a recovery plan. Funding is always a key part of the support. You have to make sure that the company, the organization, has the actual amount of financial support needed for the entire project, and more importantly, built into their safeties, so that if there is a down in a server, that you can pay for a third-party vendor to actually support the initiatives, the data that you need to keep moving on the project and transfers. And you have to have the time allotment. You can't short set your time. If you understand that your workforce can only do X amount of code per week, you have to make sure your CIO is on board with that, to say, okay, we need this, but we want to make sure, because flu season's coming up in November, that we have built-in time for people to get sick. These are all the things in your continuation plan that you need to think about a little bit deeper. And when you address, before you even start plans, the original plan itself, and define that clearly to your executives or your president. And this is where your good project managers come in, because they already have these pieces defined, and most project managers that have been successes that I've worked with, and teams that I worked with myself, we've always had defined rules and defined milestones, so that at each section we stop and we do a scope clarification. We look and see what's working, what's not working. Do we need to change or do anything at this point, at this milestone? The managers also, in my case, a lot of my role was a political shield for my workforce. I'm the one who took the hits. I went to all the bad meetings, and I understood all the different critical stages that I had to go through to work with the executives to meet their demands, which is usually answering to stakeholders. Why are we not done yet? We projected this. So I always shoot for, if I tell my CIO I'm going to have it done by this December 25th, my goal is to have it done a month early or a week early, whatever it might be, and build in parameters for disasters to happen, whether it be a flood or power outage, a manpower sickness where everybody gets flu, which I had an entire office one time. support staff get sick, and we had to bring in temporary workers. And luckily, we had built into the plan some financial constraints for this to bring in temporary workers. Another idea is that actually the project manager in this aspect to help you with this plan is a conflict negotiator. And this is one of the areas where a lot of people don't understand until they get into a management role, that it's actually the most time-consuming aspect for any manager or actual planning. A lot of times, and I go back to cases with unions, have this dynamic ability to really work this out because they have conflict negotiators between the managers and the workforces that doesn't stop the flow of business, which is great. And regular private businesses, they don't have this. They'll have the managers or middle managers who work with the actual employees or staff on the floor to kind of mitigate these things, or work through human resources to mitigate problems. But you have to build in a plan for mitigating conflict negotiation. It might be hours. I can't work this week. I can't work that week. Betty can't work this week. That you have to have constraints and think about policies in place to continue the plan. If everybody has a baseball game on Friday for their son or their daughter's softball game, not everybody can have off. There has to be rules and regulations, and that needs to be in place prior by the project manager. And more importantly, you have to have backups because people will call off. Yes, human nature is kind of deviant. They will actually be subversive and say I'm sick and call off even though they're not sick. You can't usually accuse the person, but you have to have plans in effect for that. If this falls back, what do we do? How do we manage that situation of a shortfall in human capital and keep the project on track for the next milestone? These are things to think about. And this is where your support comes in, and where good middle managers work with the project managers to say, hey, I only have 5 people. I'm destined to have someone call off sick through this project. How do we build in time and more gap time to create an extra area for gray area to where we don't know if something's going to happen or if there's a power outage? The requirements on most of these plans can be as simple as a short statement. A lot of this is built into the charters, and I like to place a lot of this material when I overdo it in my charters to where I define roles and requirements for each and every single individual inside of my projects. They know exactly what they are to do, how much their time and scope is, how much leeway they will have, which I leave a block of leeway outside of their requirements so that there is an accident happens or something happens. You never know if someone will get fired and you have to bring someone new in. That takes time. If you're working in the state, for instance, we lost a person, we had to fire them for violations, we'll call it, of ethical codes. And we had luckily built in there a time frame for hiring somebody else of 30 days. Although the problem was it was a state, and it takes a lot longer with the state positions to get hired because there's a hiring process. So we ended up being able to hire a temporary person, and later as we continued the plan, went through the state process to hire a person, which took 8 months. And by the time that person was there, that whole entire scope of that project element was done. But it was one piece and a larger piece, and we fit that person in. But these are some of the interesting pieces. I always put human capital when you'll see the requirements. It's not just the business, it's a functional and a technical requirements that you have to have. Inside of both of these, there's always a human capital element in human interactions we have to think about. Technical, we all understand, is most of the servers, the network, the infrastructure. But it's also human capital knowledge pools. And when I say knowledge pools, I'm talking about experienced workers. Experienced workers have what's called tacit knowledge. They have knowledge that they've already done through repetition or building or learning or reading books or working on other projects that they bring into each one of these teams. And when they're doing this, they pass along that tacit knowledge to other employees through exchanges. These can be explicit exchanges of written material of how to do this or how they found a different route to process wire or do something quicker or slower. But nevertheless, there's these knowledge pools that you have to think about when you're building teams. Subconsciously, you always do this, and you have to think about those plans too and you're continuing the business model if something happens. And I'll give you, for instance, if you have 2 or 3 senior coders, you understand that they have this knowledge pool of how to do the code. They probably work together. They have a seamless methodology if they're doing agile coding to where they know how to do this. But you have to build in your plan, what if one of them gets cancer and they need to take an extended leave during the project? How can you fill that void of that knowledge that's lost? What can you do? Can you pull from other resources from another department? Can you plan with another project manager to be able to swap and share? Can you build in extra time? Can you bring in someone else for training to help the junior coders or hardware installers learn from this other person? Can you take time to do that? That triple constraint comes back into factor. Each one of these stages you have to really reapply that triple constraint on everything that could possibly happen. Knowledge pools is one of the things that's not thought about. It's kind of a subtractive idea that's lingering out there that good managers will actually put into their business continuity plans, a methodology for replacing that knowledge pool that's lost. And that kind of keeps the training and initiative going along the line of the scope. Scope and milestones are kind of the key in every project management process, but more importantly, there are also ways to measure and check and say, okay, let's see where we are. Look at the risks and things we've mitigated or things that we've encountered. Are they going to be continuing? So at each stage of this planning area, the mission description should have a revision and revised stage, looking at how the milestones were met, problems that happened. If there was a mitigation situation, how did you do this? How did you define internal projects and the flow if one's slower and one is faster? What you need to do to get them all on the same course and path work. These milestone stages are great places to revise and check, and I love to call them fire drills, for a lack of a better term, because they are kind of fire drills. I would love to go in and tell my workers, power outage right now. What do you do? What has happened? Well, inside my plans, a lot of them I've had built on each milestone that they understand that there is a triple backup. There's a backup on their hard drive, there's a backup on the main, depending on the size of the project, and backed up to the third-party vendor. That each one of the milestones have backup stages. And I test to make sure that the people working for me are doing the backup situations. I was working on one project for a university once, and I did a fire drill. And I come to find out that one of the employees didn't back up any of their work for over a week and a half. And the person was just upset and said it really didn't matter. I was keeping it just on my hard drive. And I had to take them to human resources and explain the importance of the matter, that if you didn't back up this material, you could cost us weeks in the flow of the project if something did happen just to your machine. Lo and behold, not but 6 months later on another project, the same person failed to do this and was not following my milestone backups. And before a firewall backup actually happened at the milestone, we lost everything. Of course, the person was relieved of their position, which was a very good job. $75,000, $85,000 a year salary the person was making, but cost us tons of money and tons of time. And a third-party vendor trying to back up and save information that we lost because of his follies. So this is one of the things that are a little different that a lot of books and places won't talk about with disaster recovery and continuity plans, is the idea of placing firewalls and tests in on your employees. If you think about the military, they do this all the time. They're constantly drilling, re-drilling, and drilling again. And they do this so there's team building, yes, but also to look for bugs and problems. So as they go through the next stages of activities on their mission as they're planning it, they can work them out of the system and hopefully mitigate anything that's continued on in each stage. Parts of these things can be as simple as, re-examining the budgets at each time to make sure that you're on track. Schedules, making sure everything's happening. Understanding a phase approach that can happen inside of each milestone, and which is a strong way to build. They call it steps in coding. A lot of times you build with steps. So at each step mark, you should have a benchmark to where you look back and say, okay, what's the problem here? Did this flow happen? Were we okay? But building into your milestones and actual firewall protection into your plans is just a great way of the overall plan having more continuity and more ability to be a success. Planning itself really comes down at the first part of redefining that charter, constantly going back and looking at the charter and seeing elements that are failing that the project manager may not have seen in scope and size, couldn't look at because the risk wasn't there, something that was outside of the scope of understanding or seeing. Let's talk about hurricanes. Recently one just came up the coast and hit in our area and knocked out power in the neighborhoods. I didn't plan appropriately. I lost $1,500 in organic beef in a brand new freezer I bought. I planned out for the next year, but I didn't plan out smartly to buy a backup generator. I could have, if I was home, went and bought one quickly, assessed the matter, and put a backup generator in place, but unfortunately, I was out of town. I thought, because of my ideas of disaster recovery just in my own home, of having an internet-based security system, that everything would be okay. The problem happened here is the transformer blew out and blew out the entire electric to my house. So instead of me understanding that my internet's just down, my whole power was down for 2 weeks. So a lot of things you can't think about in these actions. So you have to think about those little things that can happen and plan. What if the power totally went out? And this is where good project managers come in and build that in. But more importantly, managers that are working on the disaster recovery plans and actions and building these firewalls and safeties into each stage of the plan, think about these little things too. Or recycle back in and re-examine the actual actions. The charter is always defined specifically the roles, we know that, and the organizational function. But more importantly, it also has a process in there which Bullman and Deal calls the four structures of an organization. A lot of you probably had this in project management where you talk about the political frame, the human resources frame, symbolic and structural frame. And these are important so that everybody understands inside of the scope of their actual charter who they report to, and in case of emergency, what would they do? How do they implement the plan itself? At what point does a plan become action? And more importantly, how do you track this? Track the success. Track if it's working. Track if you need team members or what top team members should do and when they should be getting together. How they will communicate in a power outage. Can they shift to cell phones? Is there ways that you can actually go back to the old-fashioned paper and pencil? I talked recently to an eye doctor. He said to me, I back everything up. I said, well, that's great. He says, you're an IT guy. And what do you think of that? I said, I think that's a really good plan. I said, how do you back it up? He said, I back it up on index cards. Every time I see a patient and I examine their eyes, I write down physically on one of these index cards, the old-fashioned way, everything that I found in their eyes, how they're doing, what their prescriptions are. He's done this for years upon years upon years. And his idea is, it's not if he's going to lose all his data that his secretary insists is perfect and she backs up on another hard drive for and they use a third-time vendor for. It's when that will all fail. Interesting planning. Another part we'll talk about is the closeout. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But looking at the frames itself of Bullman and Deals, for those of you who never really looked at this, the structural frame is kind of that one that really looks at organizational goals and how they're going to get to that scope. It defines the authority figures, and it looks more as a stage. It's here's your role, here's your role, here's your role. And it's managed more. A lot of times you see this in a family-run business. The father is the president, the son is the vice president down the line to the workers. Now, human resources frame, we are most comfortable in knowing that most of us all report to human resources, where they define every scope, and if there's conflict mitigation, everybody goes and they work as an arbitrary. The political frame is one of the hardest to deal with, and a lot of major companies always have this political framework because they're looking for a very persuasive person. The, lack of better words, the John Kennedys. They are the person that is a political leader that they are able to persuade, and they're working business deals behind the scenes. And when they do this, they act as a dictator in most cases. And what they say goes. So it's a very power central political structure to where they're the only one who does the yes and no's on any project. And they are inside of every single scope and every single phase that they sign off on. The symbolic phrase is more a person who's charismatic as well, but works with the people on the floor. I consider these are the walking presidents. They're the ones who are seen every day. They do guest lectures at universities. They go into the actual factories and work with the people hands on hand. And they're the ones who've worked their ways the whole way through the top. They may have started in the Ford Motor Company on the line putting a tire on a car, tuning an engine, painting, going up into selling the vehicles, test driving them, knowing everything about it, becoming the manager, and actually becoming the boss. These stages are really important to know because in your continuation frame, what happens if this leader dies? There has to be a plan. There has to be a way for you to fall back and everyone to know their job, their role, and inside the plan it clearly defines who's going to do what, when, and how. The human resources usually has this spelled out, and we can think about this a lot of days if we look at the United States from the president. If the president is unfortunately shot or taken out of his role somehow, the vice president comes in. We get on the Speaker of the House, and each role the whole way down through. This is kind of the same way the human resources function is, but it works great in your mitigating situations and your strategic planning where something happens to one of these leaders. The same with the structural frame. You usually know that the sun's going to take over. But the political framework is usually the board takes over to where now you have stakeholders involved, and they may not be as decisive as you'd like them to be, or more importantly, they're going to look at the bottom line before they look at the actual scope of the project and what needs to be completed. So charter proposals, I always say, is one of the first places you should look at and understand deeply how you're going to start mitigating problems before they even start. You know, understanding the business case. Why are we doing this is one of the biggest things. The financial analysis and understanding whether or not you need to go back and revise it and speak to your financial department about building in extra money, or the triple constraint, looking at this analysis and saying, do we have everything we need there? Is there a part that's missing? Should we build more into the triple constraint areas? Does that time actually fit? Can we do this? What if there is a flu bug hit our whole department and wipes it out and we're all gone for a week? How do we manage this? These are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to think about. And like I said before, having a milestone schedule and a phase of stages to reach the milestone stages and firewalls for testing each one of these and looking and examining is a great way to make sure your continuation plan is on track, or you're going to find bumps and problems that need adjusted and into the master plan put back into action. This is all part of risk mitigation, finding alternatives to things that may or may not happen. We can't see them all, but it's a great place to start recommendations if you're doing a firewall test at every single stage. Continuity planning is really about making sure you're meeting your obligations. These are addressed by the project manager and the charter itself, but making sure these sub-plans for recovery are there and checked and rechecked, because you never know what's going to happen. Power outages happen all the time in businesses. Do we have surge protectors? Do we have enough surge protectors? What happens if they fail and we blow out 3 computers? How do we manage to get 3 new computers in to our 3 key senior coders? What do they need? Do we have a backup in place for that already? Can we get them to an alternative site to work, another business location? Should we have addressed where our actual building is sit because it's in a floodplain? These are all things we have to think about. Occupancy for human capital and safety. How do we get everybody out of a building in case of a fire? If you lose somebody in the fire, it shuts everything down. Today there's a lot of different situations to where we are dealing with government regulations, and they keep continuously changing. At what point and how do you address the government changes in your plan? Is it every time that you're reaching one of your firewall stages you go back over with your legal team and make sure your contract is meeting all the obligations if you are actually a government contract, and make sure everything is on track itself? If a government inspector comes in and finds one thing out, he will shut you down, or she, excuse me, may shut you down. So these are things you have to build in your plan as well. Stages for making sure you're meeting your contract's obligations. Cyber incidents are always the go-to we all think about first, and that's why I leave it kind of last. It's the ones that a lot of time we're constantly monitoring and looking at because we have a team just doing this. What happens if you're inside of that frame and you have a protest? Have you ever seen this happen? Anonymous is one of the big company, not really company attackers that is out there today. They have agendas. They protest companies. They create massive social media bursts to go in and round up outside of companies and give them a negative perspective. You have to have a lot of times today crisis plans for communication to squash these protests or acknowledge the protests and work around them. If they attack your phones so that you can't make a phone call, so it's constant repeated phone calls coming in flooding your business, or they keep sending in viruses on attack constant, you have to have a plan to figure this out. Can you get yourself out of this server? Can you move to a third-party vendor to keep moving? Can you get somebody in there to help you? Do you have these firewalls in place? And most importantly, the constant contact with stakeholders. They are the ones that are usually being the financial backing. And in any case, in any small bump in your plan, has to have a communication method, whether it's your political leader, your president, or whomever, or the project manager immediately meeting with your president who talks to the stakeholders. This is something that has to be built in those plans as well. It's called meeting those obligations, and you should have an obligation plan in each stage in the firewall. How do we meet the obligations? Whether it's short-term, long-term, relocating, allocating different workforce, moving someone out, moving someone in. This is part of the workforce breakdown plan. They call it the WBS. You know, it's kind of a total project management for each working stage. A lot of the times in that chartings is one of the best ways to see this, and the scope and the phrases to make sure everybody's on track. It's kind of a great visual charting of when everything's going to be done and the milestones, and making sure that nothing needs adjusted, and building time into those, more importantly, in case of something happening. It's never if, it's always when. You have to look at these critical path delays. You have to have flexibility built into it, and you have to make sure in your flexibility you clearly define why and how long and what if. And these are all, of course, measurable outcomes in most cases. Again, Hubbard, I'll keep going back in your class, is a great scholar who wrote a book I strongly admit you guys to get. It's called How to Measure Anything. And it talks about mitigating risks through measuring small things through large things, and building in flexibility in your plans for mitigating this stuff and continuing. That evaluation is one of the key things that you have to think about. And one of the things is you can reject them. Is there a rationale to reject adding this into your plan? A lot of this seems like it's simplistic, but when you start thinking about it and you write down something simple, and you start thinking about all the things that can go wrong, that's when you start really building a good plan. And more importantly, communicating with everybody on your team to find out all these elements and make sure everybody is a success. So this is some of the elements that I find a success in building and starting those plans. everything from building firewalling your stages at your milestones to making sure you communicate effectively at all times with your project managers, and make sure your project managers are effectively talking to your leaders and your stakeholders. Thanks for listening, gang. We'll have another one coming up soon.